the founders understood that probably the greatest achievement of Western civilization is the rule of law. That achievement is presently at risk. And today I want to lay out the reasons why. Since summer 2014, a protest movement known as Black Lives Matter has convulsed the nation. Triggered by the police shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in August 2014, the Black Lives Matter movement holds that racist officers are the greatest threat facing young black men today. This belief has triggered riots, die-ins, the murder and attempted murder of police officers, a campaign to eliminate traditional grand jury proceedings when officers use lethal force, and a presidential task force on policing. Even though the U.S. Justice Department has resoundingly disproven the lie that a Pacific Michael Brown was shot in cold blood while trying to surrender, Brown is still venerated as a martyr. And now, officers are backing off of proactive policing under the relentless venom directed at them on the street and in the media. As a result, violent crime is on the rise. The need is urgent, therefore, to examine the Black Lives Movement's central thesis that the police are the greatest threat facing young black men today. I'm going to propose two counter-hypotheses. First, that there is no government agency more dedicated to the proposition that Black Lives Matter than the police. And second, that we have been talking obsessively about alleged police racism over the last 20 years in order not to talk about a far larger problem, black-on-black crime. Now, let's be clear at the onset. Police have an indefeasible obligation to treat everyone with courtesy and respect and within the confines of the law. Too often, officers developed a hardened, obnoxious attitude. It is also the case that being stopped when you are innocent of any wrongdoing is infuriating, humiliating, and sometimes terrifying. And needless to say, every unjustified police shooting of an unarmed civilian is a stomach-churning tragedy. Given the appalling history of racism in this country and the complicity of the police in that history, police shootings of black men are particularly and understandably fraught. That history informs how many people view the police. But however intolerable and inexcusable every act of police brutality is, and while we need to make sure that the police are properly trained in the Constitution and in courtesy and respect, there is a larger reality behind the issue of policing, crime, and race that remains a taboo topic. The problem on black and black crime is an uncomfortable truth, but unless we acknowledge it, we won't get very far in understanding patterns of policing. Every year, approximately 6,000 blacks are murdered. That's a number higher than white and Hispanic murder victims combined, even though blacks are only 13% of the national population. Blacks of all ages are killed at 6 times the rate of whites and Hispanics combined. In Los Angeles, a typical city, blacks between the ages of 20 and 24 die at a rate 20 to 30 times the national mean. Who's killing them? Not white civilians and not the police, but other blacks. The astronomical black death by homicide rate is a function of the black crime rate. Black males between the ages of 14 and 17 commit homicide at 10 times the rate of white and Hispanic male teenagers combined. Black males of all ages commit homicide at 8 times the rate of whites and Hispanics and 12 times the rate of whites alone. The police could end all use of lethal force tomorrow, and it would have at most a negligible effect on the black death by homicide rate. Moreover, The percentage of blacks among civilians killed by the police, 26%, is far less than what the black crime rate would predict, since police shootings are going to occur most often in neighborhoods where cops are confronting violent, armed criminals and people resisting arrest. 40% of all cop killers over the last decade have been black, even though, again, blacks are only 13% of the national population. Standard anti-cop ideology, whether emanating from the ACLU or the university, holds that law enforcement actions are racist if they don't mirror population data. New York City illustrates why this benchmarking rule is so misguided. Blacks are 23% of New York City's population, but they commit 75% of all shootings, 70% of all robberies, and 66% of all violent crime. Add Hispanic shootings, and you account for 98% of all illegal gunfire in the city. This means that every time the police are called out on a shots fired call, they are inevitably going to minority neighborhoods and looking for minority suspects. The police don't wish for this. They hope against hope every time they're called out that for once they will be confronting a white suspect, but the numbers are in there against them. Whites in New York City are about 34% of the population. They commit 2% of all shootings and 4% of all robberies. These disparities are mirrored in city after city. Now, this incidence of crime means that innocent black men have a much higher chance of being stopped by the police because they match the description of a suspect than white men. Now, who are some of the victims of elevated urban crime? On March 11, 2015, as protesters were once again converging on the Ferguson Police Department, demanding the resignation of the entire department, a 6-year-old boy named Marcus Johnson was gunned down a few miles away in a St. Louis park, the victim of a drive-by shooting. No one protested his killing. Al Sharpton didn't show up to demand a federal investigation. Few people outside of his immediate community even know his name. Last year in Baltimore, 10 children under the age of 10 were gunned down in drive-by shootings. In Cleveland in September of 2015, 3 children 5 and younger were gunned down in drive-by shootings. In November, a 9-year-old in Chicago was lured into an alley and killed by his father's gang enemies. The father refused to cooperate with the police. In August 2015, a 9-year-old girl was doing her homework in her mother's bedroom and was killed by a bullet that penetrated the house. Such mindless violence seems almost to be regarded as normal, given the lack of attention it would receive from the same people who would be out in droves if any of those victims had been shot by a police officer. As horrific as such shootings are, crime rates were much higher 20 years ago. In New York City in 1990, for example, there were 2,245 homicides. In 2014, there were 333, a drop of 85%. New York's crime drop is the steepest in the nation, but crime has fallen at a historic rate nationwide as well, by about 40% since the early 1990s. The greatest beneficiaries of that crime drop have been minorities. In New York, over 10,000 minority males are alive today who would have been dead had homicide rates remained at their early 1990s levels. What is behind this historic crime drop? A policing revolution that began in New York City and spread nationally. Starting in 1994, the NYPD top brass embraced the radical idea that the police can actually prevent crime, not just respond to it. They started obsessively gathering and analyzing crime data on a daily and eventually an hourly basis. They looked for patterns and strategized about tactics to try to quell crime outbreaks as they were emerging. Equally importantly, for the first time, they held commanders actually accountable for what was happening in their jurisdictions. Department leaders started meeting on a weekly basis with precinct commanders to grill them on crime patterns on their watch. These weekly accountability sessions came to be known as CompStat. They were ruthless, high-tension affairs. Sometimes chairs were thrown because the emotions and stakes were so high. If a commander was not fully informed about every local crime outbreak and ready with a strategy to combat it, his career was in severe jeopardy. CompStat created a sense of urgency about crime fighting that has never left the NYPD. For decades, the traditional rap against the police was that they ignored crime in minority neighborhoods. CompStat keeps the police focused like a laser beam on where people are most being victimized, and that's in minority communities. CompStat spread nationwide. Departments across the country now send officers to emerging crime spots to try to interrupt criminal behavior before it happens. No other government program has come close to data-driven policing success as an economic stimulus. Welfare, forget about it. If you want to turn communities around, you have got to bring down crime. In New York City, businesses that had shunned previously drug-infested neighborhoods now set up shop there, offering residents choice in shopping and jobs for local workers. Senior citizens felt safe to go out to the store or the post office to pick up their Social Security check. Children could ride their bikes on sidewalks without their mothers worried that they would be shot. But the crime victories of the last 2 decades are now in jeopardy, thanks to the falsehoods of the Black Lives Matter movement. There are signs that law and order and the moral support for such order are breaking down. Police operating in inner-city neighborhoods now find themselves routinely surrounded by cursing, jeering crowds when they make a pedestrian stop or try to arrest a suspect. Sometimes bottles and rocks are thrown. Cops are worried about becoming the latest racist cop of the week and possibly losing their livelihood thanks to an incomplete cell phone video that inevitably fails to show the antecedents to their own use of force. Officer use of force is never lovely to see. But the public is clueless about how hard it is to subdue somebody who is determined to resist arrest. Cops will tell you it can take 5 to 6 officers. As a result of the anti-cop campaign of the last 2 years and the resulting pushback on the streets, officers in urban areas are cutting back on precisely the type of policing that is responsible for our crime drop. And that is pedestrian stops and low-level enforcement of what is known as broken windows type offenses, those low-level quality of life misdemeanors. Police officers, of course, are continuing to rush to 911 calls when there's already been a victim. But responding after the fact is not how you bring crime down. You bring crime down by intervening before it happens. When it comes to making that discretionary stop, getting out of your car at 1 a.m., for example, when there's somebody hitching up his waistband on a known drug corner, officers are telling each other, you'd have to be crazy to get out of your car. Cops are human. And when they are repeatedly told that they are racist for stopping and questioning suspicious individuals in high crime areas, at some point they're going to do less of those stops. That is both understandable and, in a sense, how it's supposed to work. Policing is political. If a powerful political bloc has denied the legitimacy of assertive policing, then we're going to get less of it. But the people demanding that the police back off are by no means representative of the entire black community. Go to any police neighborhood meeting in Harlem, Central Brooklyn, or South Central LA, and you're going to hear some variant of the following requests. We want the dealers off the corner. You arrest them, and they're back the next day. There are kids hanging out on my stoop. Why can't you arrest them for loitering? The cops have to say, well, we have this constitutional precedent that says we can't do that anymore, but we'll at least talk to them. Or, I smell weed in my hallway. Why can't you do something? I met an elder cancer amputee in the Mount Hope section of the Bronx who was terrified to go into her lobby because of the kids trespassing there and selling drugs. The only time she felt safe was when the police were there. Please, Jesus, she said, send more police. The irony is that the police cannot respond to these heartfelt requests for public order without generating the very stop data that can be used against them by the ACLU or the Justice Department in another racial profiling lawsuit. Unfortunately, when officers back off in high crime neighborhoods, crime shoots through the roof. The country is in the midst of the first sustained violent crime spike in 2 decades. Murders rose nearly 17% in the nation's 50 largest cities in 2015, and it was in cities with large black populations where the violence increased the most. Baltimore's per capita homicide rate last year was the highest in its history. Washington, D.C. ended 2015 with a 54% increase in murders. Minneapolis was up 61% in homicides. And in Chicago, where pedestrian stops are down by 90% thanks to the anti-cop crusade, shootings were up 80% through March 2016. I first identified the violent crime increase in May 2015 and dubbed it the Ferguson effect. My diagnosis set off a firestorm of controversy on the anti-cop left and in criminology circles. Despite that furor, FBI Director James Comey confirmed the Ferguson effect in a speech at the University of Chicago Law School last October and was promptly taken to the woodshed by President Barack Obama for doing so. Obama had the temerity to accuse his own FBI director of cherry-picking data and having a political agenda. Now, the idea that President Obama knows more about policing and what's happening on the streets than the FBI director is, of course, ludicrous. But Comey needed to be taken down by the president and by his press secretary, Josh Earnest, because to recognize the connection between proactive policing and public safety undermines the entire premise of the anti-cop left. The overwhelming majority of victims in the current crime increase are, as usual, black, as are their assailants. But police officers are coming under attack as well. The number of officers killed in shootings more than doubled during the first 3 months of 2016. Officers are second-guessing themselves about the use of force because they're so worried about being caught on a video and being dubbed as racist. But it turns out that officers are at much greater risk from blacks than unarmed blacks are from police officers. And I'm the first that has done this calculation. But over the last decade, it turns out that an officer's chance of getting killed by a black has been 18.5 times higher than the chance of an unarmed black getting killed by a police officer. Now, I don't know what will end the current frenzy against the police. Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders are continuing President Obama's race-based calumnies against the criminal justice system, arguing that the criminal justice system is shot through with bias and that it treats similarly situated whites and blacks differently. This claim is false and dangerous. Criminologists have spent decades trying to come up with evidence of racial bias in the criminal justice system, and the honest ones have been forced to acknowledge time and again that the overrepresentation of blacks in prison is due to their elevated crime rates, not to any discrimination on the part of officers, prosecutors, judges, or juries. But this claim undermines respect for officers, increases the chance of a suspect resisting arrest, which puts everybody's lives at risk. Ted Cruz has done some pushback against the war on cops, Trump less so. It should be a much broader campaign theme. We've been in this situation before. In the 1960s and early 1970s, black and white radicals regularly directed hatred and occasional violence against the police. The difference today is that anti-cop ideology is embraced at the highest reaches of the establishment by the president, his attorney general, college presidents, foundation heads, and the press. We are playing with fire, and if it keeps spreading, it will be hard to put out. Thank you very much.